Thank you for the intro. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sumiko Wilson, and I'll be your moderator this morning. I'm a journalist based in Toronto, and my work covers music, beauty, style, and film, and how they intersect with diversity, equity, and inclusion. My work has appeared in Now Magazine, Complex Canada, The West End Phoenix, and Refinery 29, and I'm currently studying at Ryerson and completing a fellowship at the Coveter. Our discussion this morning is very special. We're excited to host Back to Black and shine a light on the Black voices in the folk space whose influences have been heard and not seen. If there are any questions throughout, just please feel free to type it in the chat or use the hand raise function, and I will see to it that those are responded to. I'll begin by introducing our incredible panelists today, starting with John Orpheus, born and raised in South Central Trinidad. Antonio Michael Downing, aka John Orpheus, is a multicultural music artist, celebrated author, and speaker. He has a memoir dropping this year, and it's already been shortlisted for several awards in Canada. It's a visceral, vulnerable memoir about Blackness, identity, and his quest for home. There is an album to go along with the memoir, also called Saga Boy, and it was voted by Exclaim as one of the 20 most anticipated albums of this year, which is incredible. His sound combines hip-hop swagger, Afrobeat energy, and dancehall charisma into a unique vision rooted in the African diaspora. Thanks for joining us, John. Next is Jenn Ivanovs. Let me know if I mispronounced your last name. Sweet. Jenn has over 20 years of experience in the live event and cultural arts landscape. She started her live event career in concert production and in festival production, or in concert promotion and festival production before moving on to a more artist-focused role at a top booking agency, the Agency Group. I'm sure you've heard of it. From there, she was recruited to work with War Child Canada on their artist relation and fundraising team. And in 2016, she left to create her own company, Jives Management, which is focused on providing creative project management for live events, support for artists, and artist-based initiatives and brand-aligned experiences. Thank you so much for joining us, Jenn.
Hi, happy to be here.
And last but not least is Samir Sam Bijal. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yep, that's good enough.
Awesome. He has been the artistic director at the Hillside Festival in Guelph since 1998. That's only 1 year older than me, 1 year younger than me, actually. The 36-year-old festival takes place annually in July on the island of Guelph Lake Conservation Area. Hillside has been presenting a winter festival called Hillside Inside in multiple downtown Guelph venues in early February since 2008. Sam also programs events, concerts, and promo at the University of Guelph, where he's worked for over 30 years. And in true form, his favorite pastime is attending concerts. Thank you so much for joining us, Sam.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So we have a lot to talk about today, and I think we should just hop right into it. Feel free to use the hand raise function, not use the hand raise function. It's your prerogative, but let's just begin. Does folk music have a diversity issue? John, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. I was thinking very hard about this week, and I think, and I'm really curious to hear Samir's take on this, actually, as a programmer of one of the sort of iconic folk festivals in the country. How do you define folk music, right? I think that's sort of like the beginning point, because, I have played at folk festivals and seen acts that I would think of as jazz or rock or different, like, far field genre wise. So I think if we're going to talk about a genre and does it have a problem, I think we should probably just lay that marker down as a definition first, so we all know what we're talking about. So I'm curious, Samir, from your point of view as a programmer, so as someone who decides, hey, who's in and who's out, And as a self-declared folk festival, how do you well, I've reputed, actually, I don't know how Hillside defines themselves, but reputed as a folk festival, how do you define that, and how do you make those decisions?
Well, okay, Hillside has actually never had the word folk in our title, but I mean, that doesn't mean that we're not. Like, you know, we've always called ourselves the Hillside Community Festival, the Hillside Music Festival, but I mean, it's no secret. We're based upon, and I use this term a lot, the folk festival model, which is really something, it's not so much about a musical style. It's more like about an attitude, and the way that you set up programming on a landscape. So, you know, I've, as far as Hillside is concerned, long before I got there, you know, in terms of getting involved, even like early on in programming before I started working for them, the festival always defined itself as something that was multidisciplinary. And I think that there's a really distinct line that gets muddy sometimes, that people get caught up in the term folk, and it can be applied to people that actually, I think, you know, abuse the term, and think that it's, well, we're a folk festival, so we're not going to have that, you know. Right. And it's just, but then there's like, well, yeah, what does folk mean? So. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there's genre-specific festivals and things like that, but I mean, as far as diversity is concerned, to be really blunt, I mean, to the folks from the Hillside camp, and I'm going back to the people who sat around a kitchen table in 1983 or something and thought that maybe it's a good idea to start a festival, you know, that it was just common sense that you have a diverse program, and it was just like, you know, being environmentally sensible. I mean, you know, you do it not because it's like, well, we have to do this. No, it's common sense. So, you know, like for a festival that takes place in a conservation area, of course, you're going to respect the land. And we did that from the start. But same thing with the programming. It was like, it was artists from different backgrounds, and it reflected the population. It reflected the region. It just reflected, like, you know, good taste. I mean, it's going to sound a little strange, but I've never felt that the term folk is something that I need to hang on to. If anything, I celebrate the fact that it's more about community than anything else.
Just to follow up on one thing you mentioned, you said it's less about a musical style, more about an attitude. How would you define that attitude?
To me, that attitude has to do with, like, it's not just, I mean, first of all, it's not just here's a bunch of bands, you know, period. It's, you know, here's a bunch of bands on a field, on a stage. Yeah. It's about the things that also happen off the stage. It's about people engaging with each other in an environment where they feel safe. They can check their tastes at the gate. You know, that's one of the things that we're very, very thrilled about it and proud of our audience over the years, is that, you know, they check their taste at the gate. I mean, they come and see artists they've never heard of. And these artists walk out on stage and they get this huge response, and they put on the sets of their lives, you know, and it's because it's an exchange, but it does have a lot to do with, and also, you know, folk festivals per se. If you go back to Estelle Klein and, you know, the Mariposa Folk Festival, it also has to do with these things called workshops, which are not workshops necessarily instructional workshops. We have those too, but it's collaborative workshops where you get, and this is another thing about this environment where you have artists from different backgrounds who don't even know each other will come and perform together on the same stage. So that's a short version of it, of an answer.
Jen, did you want to chime in? Oh, sorry, John, did you have something to add?
No. I was just going to say, as an artist, that's what I love about folk festivals, and that's what how I understand them. But I am curious from Jen's point of view as a booker, how her thoughts on that.
I mean, I know for years and years and years, Hillside is one of the festivals that people want to play regardless. Like there is, that's this sort of that sense of community, and it's one of the ones that it's never had that problem. But I have also seen other festivals that don't necessarily follow that, like especially when you're going across the country, whereas when we get into the prairies, get whiter and whiter. And there isn't necessarily that shared sense of responsibility to the land, that shared sense of like a need for diversity. Like since I was a kid coming up, it was something that I saw as a young person, and I always questioned, like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, where are the women, where are the people of color, what's going on? And I think that's what's really difficult, is that there's these wonderful exceptions to the rule, like Hillside, like the Aurelia ones, and there's so many of these great folk festivals out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the rule of thumb with all of them. Like especially when you move into the States and you look at what's happening down there, there's a lot more white faces than are expected, and it's not necessarily the rule of thumb. So I think that's where it's just looking at the broader aspect of what's happening everywhere else and how does that affect the landscape.
Despite the clear parallels that we see historically between like early African American music styles and folk, why do you think that the face of the genre is still solely associated with white acts?
Heavy. I mean, I think that it's really about, I think what Samir is saying, and I think what Jenn is saying too, is that it's really about that core, those organizers and what their agenda is, right? I've played, Harvest Gathering in Michigan, right? Michigan's a very Great Lakes state, very close to Ontario, a swing state politically, so half Republican, half Democrat, could go either way. It's got, militias and KKK, but it also has, water protectors and people who are intentionally going out to set an agenda that's inclusive. And I think that's really, I think there's a line there between, hey, there's a passive approach, which is kind of like, hey, we're all about inclusivity. We just want the best music. Of course, we're going to have a diverse setup. And then there is an active approach where you're kind of saying, hey, we actually want this to represent everyone. And I know Seth Bernard at Harvest, he intentionally wants to include Indigenous people. He intentionally wants to include, there's a big divide in Michigan between Detroit, which is very urban, and northern Michigan, which is very rural. He intentionally goes to Detroit and brings and builds bridges and brings those artists up to Harvest, which is very much like Hillside. It's on a farm in the middle of the country. And so it's a very much about nature, and the landscape is part of the festival. And he intentionally does that. My experience is, and I mean, if you just step back and just the perception of Black, like to talk about Black music, the term they use is urban. Well, I mean, you don't have to travel very far to know that a lot of Black people from the country, like, and we country as hell. Like I grew up in Trinidad in the Caribbean, in the country. I moved to Northwestern Ontario, like Dryden, in the country. I travel all through the South, and there's so many people in the country, and instruments like I played with, I'm sure someone Samir, Danny Michel. I played banjo in Danny Michel's band, a celebrated Canadian folk hero, really. And I was shocked to know that, I was in New Orleans. I messaged Danny. I said, Danny, check this banjo. He's like, amazing. You should come play banjo in my band. And I was shocked as I was researching the instrument to find it's an African instrument, which actually came over with the enslaved peoples from West Africa. and then got mingled with the culture. And so I think, Sumiko, your point is dead on, is that there is always this imaginary line that doesn't really exist. But I think it's wider culture though, because I played in punk bands as a Black lead singer, and was told that our music was too urban for rock radio in Canada, right? And so urban becomes this code word for Black, and then there's a line that you can't cross. I want to hear what everyone else has to say on this, but one of my seminal musical experiences was 2015. I'm promoting an album. It's mostly hip hop. All these my publicist is going around to all these places, and they're saying, no, we don't want it. And then one day we have to go to this place, Sirius Satellite Radio in Liberty Village, and they're like, can he play some songs? And I do hip hop, but I play a lot of instruments. So I was like, sure, I'll rearrange it for guitar. Suddenly, my publicist gets a brainwave and she says, oh, can you just videotape yourself playing guitar? And then they went around and did the same rounds to the same people with the same songs. But because I was a Black guy playing guitar, I was suddenly okay for their audience. And so I think that there's a real kind of, the excuse you hear all the time is our audience won't like this. And they say it's because it's urban or it's because it's this or that, but mostly what it's because is because you're Black, because those same stations that were saying you can't have the Black guy in a punk band, they were playing like, Canadiana white rap, which stylistically is way more outside. And so I think to address this issue of does folk music have a problem, we kind of have to look at it in the greater context of just music in Canada and go, well, where are these barriers coming from? Who's putting them up? Why are we, and can we intentionally push back against them? So that's a lot. I'm sorry, I gave you a whole podcast there, but that's why I'm here, because I have a lot of feelings about this issue.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and Sam can probably speak to this more than anyone. I love that you're using the term audience and talking about, inclusivity, but I've seen it so many times where people, they jump on a festival lineup and are like, there isn't enough this, there isn't enough that. And it's such a delicate line to walk between what the audience will actually buy tickets to and what the audience will actually support. And so hearing that, there are these promoters who will help bring in other artists and bring in those eyes, it's a delicate line, and trying to, make sure that festival sells those tickets while also bringing in like new eyes to these artists and saying like, this is important to us. This is what we want you to see. And like Hillside is a great example of doing that. But we've also seen, festivals as a whole that just straight up ignore it because all that they're really worried about is selling a ticket, not necessarily committed to that larger goal of making sure that all those voices are heard.
Mm-hmm. John, I'm glad you brought up the origin of the banjo, considering that that's so archetypal to the genre. Jenn and Sam, I'd love to hear your takes on this. Is it that the fans showing up to concerts are predominantly white and want to see themselves reflected on stage? Do you think that on the organizing side, there's a fear of upsetting or losing the primary customer base by not putting Black artists on folk stages?
I'm going to go back for a second here to
Yes.
the audience, to cover exactly what you're talking about, but also this thing about, there's this thing about educating your audience. Well, you want to be careful that you're not sitting there trying to hit people over the head, but every now and then you got to. So, I mean, as you were talking earlier, John, I had a bit of a flashback to, I think it was the year 2000. And I booked this artist to perform. It was the third year I'd been doing it, so I was still a bit new at it. And I booked this artist named Razel, the godfather of noise, from the Roots. And so he, he came with a DJ, and I put him on late Friday night, second last on the main stage. or it was the last act on the main stage on Friday night. Most people had no idea who this was. And I mean, sometimes, you know, you get a little nervous about doing something where like you're putting something on the main stage where a lot of people don't know it. And it's not even necessarily about genres and things like that. It has to do with like, well, people don't know who this is. But, you know, you just do it. So good response, good crowd. At the end of the thing, the set, an elderly white gentleman came to me. He must have been in his late 60s or something. And he said, you know, I would have never thought I would have liked something like this, you know, this style of music. But I just want to tell you that I'm completely floored by this music, you know, and this performance. And to me, that was like, see, this is where you drop the border, where you got to take chances. You know, that's the thing. I think, you know, there's times where you take, so I was taking a chance. I guess artistically I was taking a chance, but also culturally I was taking a chance. I didn't necessarily realize it as much so at the time, even though I knew that this was kind of maybe a little different for some of our audience. But I mean, if I look back to some of the other festivals back in that era, you know, even the old early or the other incarnation of the Ottawa Folk Festival, which I went to a few times, you know, yeah, I would be able to go see Emmylou Harris there and people like that. But then, you know, they would have Michael Franti and Spearhead, you know, and everybody would get it. And so, yeah, you deliver it in front of your audience. And at the end of the day, as long as it's good, I think that, you know, those of us who are fortunate that attract audiences that are willing to be challenged, you know, and sometimes, you know, you take a little bit of flack where like somebody goes, well, what is he doing booking punk rock at a folk festival? You know, that's where you sit there and you go, well, what's the definition of a folk festival? Come on, you know, Pete Seeger was a punk rocker, you know, so yeah, that kind of thing.
It's so interesting. I think a lot of people don't see it this way, but it's so true. Like event production is true taste making. Festival, like curating festival lineups is true taste making, and defining the taste and reflecting the taste. There seems to be like a tension there between satisfying the patrons of the genre and actually pushing the genre forward at these festivals. Jen, did you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think Sam kind of nailed it there, where it is sometimes you have to take a risk, and that's kind of what we're pushing people to do now, is to take those risks and to speak up and to talk about it and just put it out there that, you know, we need to be open, we need to be pushing each other. And I mean, I'm always going to nail everyone over the head, but that's just my personality. So, but I love seeing that, you know, there are these wonderful festivals that are successful, like Hillside, that are out there that do have these audiences that, you know, if you go to, there's safe and there's an openness. And I want to see more of that happening and it expanding to other places as well.
Yeah.
Sam, you touched on this a little bit when people were asking you, why'd you book these punk rockers? Was there ever an instance where you diversified a lineup and got some backlash, whether it was from patrons of the festival or from fellow organizers?
Not really. No, you know, it's interesting that when I think of like moments over the years where there's been issues of some kind of controversy or complaint, I think the one that stands out, and I will not name the band, but it had nothing to do with this subject. It had to do with them being on our main stage and mocking the women's tent. And we threw them out, threw them off our site, you know, like that was like where, you know, I'm thinking of like, yeah, otherwise, you know, there's really not been any, it comes a lot from, I think there's a certain community out there that feels that it's less so now. Back in the early 2000s, when the festival world was, you know, that I'm part of, I think was a bit young in terms of multidisciplinary festivals. This is like the not-for-profit type festivals, and but there's things like the Calgary Folk Festival and the Winnipeg Folk Festival, Edmonton. I mean, they all have incredibly diverse programming. They're all part of the same model, right? But in Ontario, there wasn't as many doing that. I mean, Sunfest is Sunfest. I mean, it's everything under the sun, and it's fantastic. So there's no issue there about diversification. It's by design, right? So, but in Ontario, there was a bit of controversy from. I took a little bit of flack from certain communities about, like, what is he doing? Like, there's, but at the same time, I mean, the nature of events like our types of festivals where you have multiple stages, is you always have, you don't want to be a complete like moron and go, well, if you don't like it, leave. You have stuff for you try to provide stuff for everybody, right? I mean, it's not like you ignore your demographic, but you also want to try to encourage. One of the things that we've really tried over the years is to bring out other communities by also bringing artists that, that are not somebody that they would expect to see at a festival like ours, I mean, and even going as far as bringing, like, 8 Tibetan monks from a monastery, like that was something which was like, what are you doing there? It's like, well, and people understood what it was. Once it happened, they totally understood what it was. But, you have stuff that you bring from the Middle East, from all different countries. And, the population in our regions, we have folks from all these communities, right? So they come out. And so that's also, it's also trying to diversify your audience. I mean, we are in Ontario, but Ontario is an incredibly diverse place in terms of like who lives here. So I think a lot of it is just that, that chatter to do with being given the gears about doing some kind of programming, which is outside of certain people's comfort zone. At the time it was like, I went, well, sorry, if you don't like that and you're at our festival, then, go see this, if that's what your tastes are, but beyond that, it was kind of like, I think it's our job as programmers, to challenge our audiences, and that's what this is about. And also the sector, the sector of programming, I've watched festival lineups over the last 20 years become much, much more diverse. And that's great to see. It's still not enough, but it's getting there.
That's incredible. We did have a great question in our Q&A function, but before we move on to that, just to stay on this topic, John, as an artist, were there ever instances where you were added to a lineup and you felt out of place, or you got backlash for being there in the folk space?
I feel like I'm a Black musician in Canada, so there's pretty much every stage I go on, I'm not fitting the genre. And just the way I do music, I'm not someone who's trying to fit a genre. I'm always someone who's trying to mash something up or challenge or bring together these things that I'm really passionate about, and they come together in me, and then I express it. So, the punk rock might have some soul singing on it, or the Afro beats might have, your hip hop might have some dancehall soca in it. And so for me, that's just a natural way of how I consume music. But, to Sam's point earlier, I think, I think that we underestimate audiences, because I think they're always purists. I mean, there's people who wanted to kick Bob Dylan out of the folk scene for playing electric instruments, once upon a time. So, and that's part of the folk music festival legacy. And so there's always purists, but most people, it's about the spirit of the event. And you heard Sam say, like, leave your tastes at home. So I think that cultivates a certain group of people who just come because they want to hear what's new. They want to hear what they want to discover something that they didn't think they'd like. And, you know, like I was talking to Max Wallace last night, one of the founders of the Ottawa Folk Festival with Chris White, a Black musician. And Max, you know, an activist, a Jewish activist. And so the attitude of inclusion was stitched into it. And so more to your question, yeah, like you know, I used to play punk bills, metal shows, hip hop shows, and at the hip, like I'm a kid who grew up. When I grew up, like the white people thought I wasn't Black enough, and the Black people thought I wasn't Black enough. So there's these prescriptions of Blackness. So when you wear it on your skin, anywhere you show up, you're not going to fit. So if I show up to the hip hop shows with live drums and some guitars with some distortion on it, that's going to be a problem. If I show up to the rock show, but I do a hip hop verse or some spoken word, that's going to be a problem. So almost every space that I've been in, I've been the person that's been, hey, should they be there? But oddly enough, it's not usually the fans that make that assertion. It's usually the people in the middle. It's usually the business people who will say, well, we can't add you to our station because our fans can't handle that. Or the agents who will say, well, I can't book you because you don't really fit anything we have already. Or, you know what I mean? And, or the venue that'll say, well, you know what, you're not quite our taste. But anytime I've ever gotten in front of fans, it doesn't matter where it's been, there's been a connection with the music. And so again, to my point, I just think that you know, you're curating a festival and you have to have the excuse that our fans can't handle it is actually just a cover. It's a cover. It's a cover that people of color get when in the corporate world, when they say, oh, you're just not a fit. You know, it's kind of this arbitrary thing that's used to kind of push people aside. But in actual fact, your fans can handle it if you challenge them, curate it, set it up in the right way, frame it. There's almost nothing your fans can't handle. I mean, I remember playing I think it was Summer Folk with Danny Michelle, and we saw this band, and the band was called Gandalf and the something something something. They had a really long name, and they were from upstate New York. And they were such a heavy rock band. They were like hard rock. And people went nuts. They were like, they loved them. They wanted all the drum solos, all the heaviness, and you would never think they would fit. And again, I just think that curators, you know, so yeah, I'm giving a big podcast again, but to your question, absolutely, I've been that person. My entire career has been being that person. Which is why I want to talk about this today. But I think the onus still rests on the business people, like the people in the middle, the people that are doing Jenn's job and Sam's job and aren't as enlightened as them, who need to actually grow a spine and challenge their audiences. Because look, the festivals that are doing the best are the most diverse. You know, I would say, well, you know, in this side of the country anyway, I would say Ottawa, Hillside, those are the festivals that everyone wants to play because they are doing the diversity and the inclusion is just stitched into the philosophy and the vibe and the spirit. It's just not in the spirit to be elitist and to shut things out. It's in the spirit to just be like, oh, wow, here's something new. What can, let me take it for what it is. And so I've certainly depended in my entire career on audiences just being willing to open their minds, because, you know, my music has never fit anything very neatly.
Absolutely. So Eve, we're going to get to your question now. She said, I would love to hear more from panelists about who we think our audiences are and how we create events that are welcoming and enjoyable to a wider, more diverse audience. In other words, not just presenting artists from a variety of backgrounds, but creating events that are more inclusive overall. Jenn, where do you think we can start with this?
I mean, that's a heavy one.
It is.
To kind of tie into what John was just saying about there being that kind of middle ground of the people who are behind the scenes and tying that into audiences, like it is, there's a lot of, especially here in Ontario, very white audiences where you may only see like a few people of color coming to these more grassroots, more folk events. And I think, you know, there's definitely been a perception over the years of what it is and definitely where it's located. Like in Toronto, we can have a show that will be completely like the Bud stage will be full of nothing but white people. And then, you know, you can go to a smaller club where it's a complete mix and a broad, you know, diverse audience in there. There isn't really an easy answer about how we make everyone feel more comfortable. I think when it comes to statements from festivals about, you know, inclusion and openness and actually carrying that out and making sure that your staff carry it out, we've seen everything happen from horrific stories with like security guards, staff who work at events, you know, not being as actually open and welcoming as they say, but it's something that we have to keep pushing everyone to actually put into play. Like I am very, very, very sick of seeing diversity and inclusion statements on everyone's websites that are just fancy fluff. Like if I go to one more audio presenting, you know, production company page and see, here's our diversity statement, and here's our staff photo of all white people and one person of color. And it just drives me bonkers because, you know, we can keep saying that we want to be diverse, we want to be inclusive, we want to be open. But when the cards are on the table right now, and I've had it happen with clients over the past year where I'm saying, okay, you could use this person who's this 60-year-old white man you've used for years and years and years, or here is a new up and coming front of house who's a person of color. And they're like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go with my tried and trusted old guy. And I'm like, why? How is this actually changing anything that you've said you're going to change? Why are you not being open? Why are you not doing this? And it's difficult because other than putting those actions into play and actually asking those questions and changing our behind the scenes staff and changing how we think and how we look at things, it's not going to change. And we can't see much changing from our audiences until they really see, you know, themselves reflected in who's presenting and what's going on. Sam, I think you might have a few thoughts on this one as well.
Yes, take it away, Sam.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of goes back to me like when you think of like, you know, how festivals start. So if somebody was going to start a festival now, after the pandemic is over, I suppose is one way to say it. So what would you take into account? You know, it's pretty different than things that are being adapted that are trying to catch up to the awareness that we're talking about, you know, the consciousness. You know, there's a comment in here from Chris about, Chris White from about systematic issues to do with granting and stuff like that. Well, that I agree with them. But it is changing. I mean, the grant landscape has woken up because they had to. I mean, they had to wake up. I mean, it's not even a question of saying, well, you should, or they did it. They're doing it. I'm watching it happen. And, you know, but I'm also very, very careful about how there's a very fine line between reality and tokenism, you know, that you don't just do it to wave a flag. You know, it's just like, well, yeah, we're doing this, man. You know, like, I mean, I'm really sensitive about that subject. I mean, I'm a person of color. I mean, I grew up in this country. And yeah, I mean, I could talk about racism and all these different things that have happened over the years when I was younger and all this stuff. But if you're going to start a festival right now, what would you think of? Like, you know, like, it's an interesting time to do that, because it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, I can sit there and say how Hillside, the people that started Hillside, this is a university town, okay? I mean, I'm sitting here in my university office, but universities are fairly fertile environments. They're supposed to be fertile. Artistically, the arts communities in towns that have universities are like smaller towns too, like Guelph and Peterborough and Kingston and stuff. You know, like there's pretty strong arts communities there. So here, the people that started the Hillside, they had it in them that there was going to be a diverse program, you know. But I think that the situation now, and I'm trying to find the right words here, is that what people would need to consider and how they would look at what they're doing. You know, they have lots and lots of reference points to look at. And besides, you know, making sure that, you know, you're doing sound financial planning and you know, having you know, treating your land with respect and all, you know, all that kind of stuff. Is there a market for what you're doing, you know? But there's a lot of festivals that you can look at and go, well, this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing. So I think that now, you know, there's this thing about how you're gonna look at things that have been happening for many, many years, you know. And is there something going on with this festival where, like, and I mean, I watch it, you know, we're all part of these communities, and you watch criticism being laid onto people, you know, like where you're having like, they put out their poster of lineups, you know, and yeah, you know, like there's the big font festivals, you know, where like you've got the first 5 acts in like, you know, huge font, and then everybody in something that you can hardly read. And you know, there's all these little things that go on the way that actually stand out, where if you're trying to get a point across, and also sell tickets. I don't know. I'm sort of going around in a big circle here, but I mean, I think that, you know, there's a lot of examples.
Absolutely, Sam. I think you've touched on so many great points. To read out the note from Chris that you mentioned, he put it in our panelists chat, but I'll read it for the attendees because it's just so good. It says, there are systemic, invisible barriers built into grant application processes that result in non-mainstream artists receiving less financial support and fewer career development opportunities than mainstream artists, resulting in fewer non-mainstream artists for programming to select from. We need to identify and remove those systemic barriers so that non-mainstream artists have better access to resources. If we were to begin by identifying those systemic barriers, in your experience, John, where would you start with that?
Wow, it's a big thing. I mean, I think in terms of the festivals themselves, I think, you know, I think, and maybe Sam might argue different, but I think it's a matter of survival. If society's changing and if you're not, you're in trouble. So I think in the festivals themselves, look, you need to change the people. Leadership needs to be going, because you can have all of those diversity statements you want, but if that person isn't in the room to say, hey, look, actually that doesn't work, or hey, look, here's some artists you have not thought of that we should consider, or even just to see like people of color, women, just, you know, female sound people, female, you know, people of color in the mix, like just supporting it as part of it. Otherwise, it's just, you know, it's just what always happens, right? In diversity everywhere, it's just kind of a token thing. The grant structure, I mean, that's certainly important, because we live in Canada and the way music is funded in this country, the grant structure is basically, it creates haves and have-nots, right? you know, I know sort of pop rock musicians who have bought whole houses off of factor grants over, you know, over a period of time. It's been their main source of funding for their career, and they live these successfully middle-class lives off of it. And then I know equally talented hip hop artists that have gotten nowhere because they haven't had the same access to grants. And so how do you change that? Well, who's on the factor jury? Who's on the board of directors? You know, like, and I think, like, to Jenn's point, everyone says all these things, but when you look at it, the people running the Canadian music industry have been the same people for a very long time, like the people at the highest levels. And when you look at the face of those industries, the CEOs, the boards of directors, all you see is a lot of white maleness. And so if you're talking about how do you change it, well, you know, it's like looking, have you ever looked at the board of directors for CIBC or TD Bank or Royal Bank? Yeah, it tells a story. And so until the people change in those rooms, you're just going to have a kind of tokenistic, how do you even know, right? Like, you could say our festival is going to be diverse, but how do you know those artists? How do you know those tastes? How do you know what affects who in what way? How do you have that conversation? You have to change the people. And I think I would start with the infrastructure of the Canadian music industry, which is, you know, for private enterprises like festivals, I think the leaders of those festivals have to make choices about who's around them and who's in the room. But I think for sort of the public infrastructure, which is the grant system, so we're talking Factor, we're talking the Ontario Arts Council, et cetera, we need to change. There's structural things about how we do it. It is sort of set up to reward the most pop friendly, because they're going to report back to the government and say, hey, what'd you do with our $5 million? And they're going to say, well, look at all these like very successful artists we funded. But there's an element to this that goes beyond commercial success. And I think that the system has a very hard time taking that into account. And currently, I feel it's very much, hey, can you prove that you're going to get this much movement on social media and this much movement in all these places? You know, not illegitimate, but I think there are other factors about diversity, about who we are as a society, about supporting art that otherwise can't get other support. Like, I don't need support. I can tour, I can make money, I welcome it, but there's a lot of artists who, if they don't have that support, they basically can't do what they do. And so there's a thing about changing how it's structured, but for me, that starts with changing who is structuring it. And I think on all those public boards of all those grants, we really need to kind of say, well, look, it's time for it not to be the same white guys making the decisions. Because, I mean, like, really at the highest levels, it's always been that. Like, I went to the Junos 4 years ago, bumped into the same two guys I bumped into when I went to my first Junos in 2003. And they're even more powerful now. I'm not going to name names, but they're even more powerful now than they were in 2003. And in 2003, they were pretty powerful. And basically, we can't just wait for a whole generation of old white guys to retire, right? We can't wait for that to happen. Like, there needs to be movement. In the US, in other music markets, there's no way the same people running it at 2000 is running it at 2020. Like, there's a faster turnover, there's more energy coming in, there's more movement, and we have to kind of create that, because the fact is, if you get power in Canada in anything, because of our small population and because of the way we love monopolies in things, basically that's for life. And I don't think that that's conducive to a rapidly changing society. We're changing in our attitudes, what we want to, who we want to be, how we want to represent ourselves, but the dudes from the 90s are still calling the shots.
Mm-hmm. Jenn, that was so insightful. John, thank you for sharing that. So much to touch on, but Jenn, in your work, you've really touched every corner of the industry in your decades of work. In your day-to-day, what does that restructuring of power look like for you?
Oh, I mean, so for me personally, it's been changing who I work with and changing how I work and how I look at everything from programming to hiring processes. I've become very outspoken in the past 2 years, which has even resulted in there are people who might not necessarily find me as the right fit for their project anymore because of it. But to me, I'm also saying, well, you're not the type of person that I want to work with if you're not actually going to uphold what you're saying and how you're approaching this. It's definitely difficult. There's definitely changes happening. I mean, looking at granting and knowing some of the people that are there, like Factor is changing. One of the things that's also very difficult right now when you look at grants and everything that's happening is there's a lot of emergency funds out there. And so the regular grant structure that people have been looking at for year after year is kind of getting pushed to the side while they deal with emergency funding and how that's being dealt out. And I will say that as much as there are so many issues that have been in that granting structure in the past, we are lucky in Canada that we have it. Like in the States, I mean, I remember when I was a teenager interviewing Bad Religion, and we were talking about back then when it was like, oh, Factor might go away, or like these other programs are going to go away. And they were like, what do you mean? Like, the government is paying for you to do things? Like, let's get in a van and tour. And I was like, Canada's a very different country than America. And then we got into a whole thing. But little punk rock teen Jenn definitely got her butt handed to her by Bad Religion about grants and things. But I think it's like we've said, it's, holding people accountable and looking at who we're working with, what we're doing, and keeping those changes coming. And I have seen, certain people getting put into positions of power, like Warner Music just brought in a new president of the company who is a person of color. And, we're seeing this. And the thing that I have to hate and think about when I look at this is this a token move? Like, is this company doing this just to say, hey, look, we did this? Or are they actually standing behind their words to become more diverse and open? And just, it's kind of the idea of like, question everything, but also support it. Like, if we're going to be putting people in positions that we can help change and help keep growing, we've got to do that. And we've got to be supportive of each other, and we've got to be supportive of the movement forward. So that's kind of a little bit of it, I think.
We're unfortunately winding down on time, but I did want to touch on one of the comments that we got. Christoph said, perhaps the commitment needs to be equally focused on attracting a diverse audience and engaging those communities with some smaller shows leading up to the festival. So perhaps the solution is spacing out programming throughout the year. But to touch on his earlier point, how do you think, as artists, as in production, that we can create spaces that diverse audiences will want to come to, and in turn create more diverse lineups? John, what do you think?
I'm looking at a comment right now, and I think it really hits it for me. What about a more meaningful engagement with actual diverse communities beyond just the artists? And I think I feel like that's what I've seen at Harvest Gathering in Michigan, where there's an actual year-round engagement with the Anishinaabe communities around water protection, with the communities in Detroit around racial justice, and that just sort of bleeds into the festival, and the festival is kind of like an extension of that engagement. That to me is how you you not only get more artists in and more diversity, but you educate your current audience, you expose them to new things, and you draw a new audience. To me, that seems like a really grassroots and effective way to go about it.
Mm-hmm. Jen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, it's definitely something that I've kept in mind. When I did our drive-in festival event last year, it was very, very important to me to find a way to touch base with the Indigenous community that was out there. And what it came down to was something that people didn't even really necessarily see, which was me having conversations with the chief. He came out to some of our events. We met with him. We spoke with him. We spoke about, ways that we could work together in the future. And then just to try and engage the audience that we had there, we incorporated, we had 2 Indigenous artists do our posters for us, and we did an on-site art show to try and just bring to light the idea. It was in Prince Edward County, which is one of the whitest communities that there is out there right now, and very, 1% people with money. But to me, I was like, I need to put this artwork from someone forward just to be in there. And everyone loved it. They were all talking about it. She had a great weekend where she got to engage with so many people, but it's finding those small things that you can do to keep engaging with the communities and keep engaging with artists, that you can keep bringing little pieces in there that over time we're going to be able to make it more diverse and more open and more inclusive.
Thank you, Jen. Sam, what's Hillside's strategy for attracting a more diverse audience?
Well, I mean, we are, on the one hand, the whole concept of like trying to provide, multidisciplinary programming, multicultural programming, but at the same time, I mean, that you can do that and it doesn't necessarily reach the people. And that's something that we've actually, I think, is one of our biggest challenges, is how to get further into the communities. I mean, whether it's Chinese community or any community that we've had, music from all over the world. I mean, there's people that perform, and these days, of course, there's so many artists that are based in Canada. We're very fortunate that there's so many artists that are based in Canada that are coming from different backgrounds, that are performing at our festivals and so forth. But this idea of actually having some stuff happening during the year, in different facilities, because not everybody is comfortable going out to a festival out at a lake, and so you got to give them a little bit of the teasers and say, well, maybe you can come and see this in this community center or this theater, and there's less reluctance to the pilgrimage out to a conservation area. Which is, we could get into, that's a whole other subject in itself.
It's all about meeting people where they're at. We're down to 1 minute, so I have one more question. We'll go around. Who are Black folk artists that our audience should have on their radar right now? And John, you can't say yourself.
Well, I think I go back to where I started. It's like, what do you consider folk? Really is what it is. I mean, to me, there are just so many artists that I mess with, and I'm not gonna call it out, but I'm just gonna say that whatever is in the spirit, expand what is in the spirit of the artist that you're looking at, like the spirit of your festival, whatever that idea was around the table, expand how you define it, and you'll find artists of all variety just waiting to come and bless your proceedings.
Absolutely. Jen, who are some Black artists that you are excited about right now?
I mean, there's so many.
It's crazy.
I was like, Arlo Parks was in town last night and I forgot about it. There's so much going on. I'm obsessed with Havaya Mighty. I, want to see everything she does forever, and those sisters are so great. I've been listening to a lot of like Allison Russell, and I could go on for days. Are we supposed to be one? With that.
Absolutely. I'm going to be adding all of those to my Spotify playlist. And Sam, last but not least, who are some Black artists in the folk space who you're really excited about right now?
Well, I mean, Jenn mentioned a couple that I am, but a dude named Clarel, based in Quebec. I highly recommend you check him out. There's a fellow in the States named Trey Burt, who's awesome. So I'm just going to name those two for now. But there's tons, but
yeah, the question chat is blowing up right now with artists.
It is. And I hope that our takeaway is that there's no shortage of talent and that our stages should be more diverse. Thank you guys so much for all of your insight here. This was such a great chat. So much we didn't touch on, so let's keep the conversation going. Thank you to Folk Music Ontario. Thank you to Advanced Music Canada. And thank you to our incredible panelists. This has been great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Sumiko. Great job.
Thank you guys. Take care, everyone.